Well, hi everybody. Welcome to another author interview. I have had a winning streak lately with books and with absolutely lovely authors. And today I am beyond thrilled to be talking with Madelaine. Madelaine, I didn't ask you, is it Madelaine or Madeleine?
It's Madelaine, actually.
Madeleine. Okay, I'm glad I asked. Madelaine Lucas, who is the author of Thirst for Salt. You all have seen me talking about this, sharing about it, reviewing it, loving it. And this is such a treat for me. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Deb. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know it's a busy time. Do you teach? Is you're also
I
you're writing?
do.
Okay. So you're heading back
Yeah,
into the collegiate year.
I'm actually not teaching this current coming semester. So I'm having a bit of extended time off, but
Nice.
yeah, I'm enjoying like the downtime of the summer. I love the structure of semesters. I feel like it's just always made sense to me when I was a student, and now it feels so familiar being part of that world again.
I agree. I so agree with that. And I don't teach, but I work with students. So
Mhm.
I do live by that semester too, and by the semesters. And you're right, it adds structure to the
Mhm.
year. That okay. If you don't mind, I'd love to start with having you just tell us a little bit. I was saying to Carl Gary the other day, the elevator pitch of Thirst for Salt. Like, tell us in your own words what this story is about for for people who have not or who just love to hear the author describe their own work.
Yeah, I think when I'm asked to describe it, I normally just simply say like it's a love story. But I do think of it as a story about many different kinds of love. So at the core of the novel is this kind of foundational relationship a young woman has the year she's 24 with a man almost 20 years her senior in a small Australian beach town. And they meet when she's on holiday with her mother. And what kind of begins as a brief whirlwind romance becomes something deeper and more formative and life-changing. But that said, the narrator's relationship with her mother is really key to this novel. There's also her friendships with her college friends, but also with another older woman called Maeve, who she meets in this small beach town. And also the love of a good dog that her and this older man, Jude, adopt during the period that they live together. So when I say it's a love story, I'm sort of being a bit cheeky because I do think of it as being, I was going to say more complex than that, but honestly, what is more complex than love? Like to me, literally nothing. So
Well, first of all, that is a great description. You like that you literally, but I was going to get to this later, but I'm going to bring it up now because the way that you talked about it when I reviewed this, I devoured this book. I absolutely devoured it. And I'm the kind of reviewer that needs to, I take notes when I read, and then I need to review it right away because it's fresh in my mind. And like when
Mhm.
you read so much, but this I did describe it as a love story, which it is. But as I reflected on it, over, I guess I read it for the first time a month ago. As I reflected on it, as I connected with you and realized that we were going to speak, and I read it again, I realized there are a lot more layers to this.
Mhm.
The relationship of our narrator, and I want to get to talking about unnamed narrators too. There's so much to talk about. But the relationship of our narrator and her mom is another level. It's very unique.
Mhm.
Their relationship is I think is very interesting. I did talk about in my review that I found King the dog as an animal person, as a huge dog person, that was kind of unexpected, beautiful, and really played an important part of exposing who each of our main characters are at their
Mhm.
core.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I do think it's definitely a book for dog people or animal people.
Absolutely.
Um, because if you've had that kind of bond with an animal in your life, you know that it is real love and it's life-changing love, I think, as well, just like
Yep.
you can have with people, with partners, with your parents, with children. These are relationships that define and shape who you are. And I do think, I love the way that you said that the dog is a way of revealing, like, I maybe, I don't know who these characters are at their core in some way. I think there's something, a way dogs particularly express their feelings and emotions. There's a kind of purity to it that I think that we can back away from as humans. That said, I also really wanted King to be a character in his own right, and not just be a metaphor, to feel like a dog that you could see and you knew the texture of his fur and you could picture him in your head. He had to, I always say that, in novels, if there's an animal or even a child character, like, they also need to have their own motivations, and their own desires as well.
I agree. Well, when you say you need to picture this and feel this, your writing is some of the most descriptive, evocative prose I have come across. Again, as I read it again, I stand by it. It's even more, it's absolutely beautiful. I was talking with someone, I had a guest on the podcast, my podcast, when my daughter was away, and I do this, like, we do what's called faves and flops, our favorite books of each month and ones that didn't work. And both of my guests and myself said we were talking about your book and that it was a favorite of the month of July. But that was what we came back to, how descriptive your writing it is, how it almost has, I said, like an ethereal vibe. I mean, it just has, I don't know, it's hard to describe. I just say to people, you have to read it. The word I finally came up with when I was talking about it on my story, is just intoxicating.
Thank
Absolutely
you.
intoxicating.
Thank you so much. I really did. I wanted it to feel like a kind of portal, like, not just for, well, for the reader, of course, but also for my narrator. Like, that this memory would, that her reflections and her memories would open up like a whole sensory world. And I think part of that honestly came, because I was writing about Australia, where I grew up, from the distance of oceans away, like living in New York City. And I think that experience of kind of living for a while in a place that was so different really revealed in stark contrast a lot of the things that I'd taken for granted about the place that I grew up. And I don't think that you need to move across the other side of the world to have that experience. I mean, we were just chatting a little earlier about all the different places you've lived and all the different climates between, you know, New York, Vermont, Texas. I think that if you make those moves, you suddenly kind of see where you're from in a different light. And there were like certain smells and textures that just weren't part of my life anymore. And I think that in terms of writing the novel, that actually turned out to be a really generative thing, because it put me in a similar position to my narrator, where we were both sort of longing for this time and place that was out of reach.
Well, yeah, it's beautifully done. I've heard other authors say that they find in their setting, as they are reflecting on a place. I think it was Kayla Mayuri, Mother in the Dark.
Yes, yeah. Kayla is a friend of mine.
Oh, is she? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That we featured. I have not spoken with her. I would love to, but that was one of the books that my daughter and I featured. We always do a monthly book on our podcast, and we did that. And because the setting being Boston, and I'm from Boston, and she talked about reflecting on that. And there were so many places that I felt like, I know this place. But I felt like, yes, Australia is a huge part of the way you talk about the fires and the beach. And so in terms of the layers, as I reflected on it, I said the mother, daughter, but also home.
Yeah.
That's a big piece of this.
Yeah, I think the idea of home is something that's always been really interesting to me. Similar to my narrator, you know, I'm always careful to point out that the book is not autobiographical at all. It really is true fiction. But, you know, in the way that writers do, that you pull certain things from your own life experience. And I also grew up moving around a lot. My parents separated when I was very young. And so that idea of home has always been kind of very elusive to me in some ways. And I was interested in the idea of the homes that you build over the course of a lifetime, like beginning with your first family that you're born into. In my case, you know, there was a rupture, so there were many homes that were built along the way. But then, you know, you move out and you have this first experience of homemaking with maybe your college roommates or in a shared house like my narrator has. And then she, you know, moves from there to build a home or a kind of home with her older boyfriend, Jude. And just, yeah, that idea of home has been something that maybe isn't fixed, but is changeable and is also therefore kind of a creative act. It can be made and remade. And of course, on a personal level, I was also writing this book while trying to establish a new home and a new life for myself. You know, I was newly married, living in a different country. So I think all of those ideas kind of filtered their way into the novel as well.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I have to ask, how long was the writing? How long did it take you to write this?
It's a tricky question to answer because I kind of lived with the characters in my head for a long time. So the first iteration of this story was a short story that I wrote when I was actually 24, the age that my narrator is in that formative summer. And it was about her relationship with this older man. King was part of the story. Her mother wasn't quite part of the story yet, but she came not too long after. So that was, yeah, almost 10 years ago now.
Wow.
And for a while, I thought that I was going to write a series of short stories. And so I wasn't working on this novel consistently for 10 years, but I felt myself continually pulled back to these characters and this setting almost compulsively, like I couldn't quite let them go.
Right.
And I've since kind of found that like that normally means that like they haven't taught me everything they have to teach me, or I wasn't done with them, they weren't done with me. So I think it was, you know, during grad school, I was writing these stories. And then it was, I think in about halfway through 2018, I kind of realized that there was one longer story there. And that's when I kind of chopped everything up, repurposed it, and really started from the beginning again with the intention of writing a novel.
I'm so glad it came together the way it did. And I hear that often from authors saying these characters it wasn't like I sat down and said, I'm going to write Thirst for Salt. It's just, they just kept coming back to me. And I find that fascinating as somebody, I'm not a creative writer. I think that's just so cool.
It's so strange. It makes you feel a little nutty that you just have these people that don't exist and
No,
you're
thank
like
goodness
talking
we
them to
have
you in your head.
as a reader. Thank goodness. I always think to myself, I hope we never run out of stories. You know,
Yeah.
it's just there, and there are so many out there. But so one of the things we've touched on that we've said a couple of times is that, and I said I find that this is having a literary moment. Two of the things that your novel does. One is the unnamed narrator. So we don't know, she does not, like she's our narrator, but like her you know, Jude has a name, and her mother doesn't. Her mother is not named. Am I right?
That's right. Her mother doesn't have a name.
But her brother does. So tell me about, we'll first talk about that. Tell me about that decision. And was it, you know, how did you come to that, and what do you feel it?
Yeah, it's a great question and something I've thought about a lot. I think that largely it was intuitive. When I started writing parts of this novel, as I said, it's not autobiographical, but I was putting so much of my own thoughts and feelings into it that it was hard in the initial stages to fully separate that character from me or a part of myself. And every time I tried to give her a name, it just kind of felt really forced and artificial. And so I just didn't think about it for a while. And every now and then I would try and come up with a name that suited her. And then the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I really want the reader to have this intimate experience with this book. I want you to feel like you're inside her head, or she's talking to you and telling you a story, not necessarily out loud, but just have that real sense of intimacy. And I think that every time a name came into the picture, it seemed to kind of put that at a distance, in a way. It never really seemed to work. I didn't feel as much like you were inside her head. And then I also just think there's like a really interesting literary tradition of unnamed narrators. I mean, this is something that literary fiction has been playing with for a long time, like the idea of truth. And I'm talking about going back to like novels like Dracula, where they, were using fake newspapers as part of the storytelling process, or epistolary novels and things like that. I think there's something really exciting to a reader about the possibility that they're reading something that's really true. And
Right.
I was, interested in kind of playing with that line and tempting people with the idea that it could feel like memoir at times.
I think it works, and you're right. There is a great tradition of it. I love, thinking back to so many books that I love that employ this. But I feel like sometimes we also, when there's we all have preconceived notions with names, and it almost like gets in your way of
Yes.
feeling just knowing this narrator, like who she is, just I don't know how we feel about her without her being, Deb or Madelaine or
Exactly. And I feel like maybe my feeling was that it would allow the reader, or invite the reader to kind of put themselves more into her experience, or relate to her experience in some way, because it could be shared, it could be yours, it could be anybody's,
Yep.
in a different way than if this character had a name and it was just this one woman's story.
Yeah, it worked great, and it added to the feel of the book. I mean, um I can't think of another book that I would say, the woman who leads my book club, that she has like a section of books it's like all vibes. I think she calls it all
I
vibes, no
love
plot
it.
or something. And I mean, this does have a plot, but like when you're just like, I just want a book that evokes, vibes, emotion, like this,
Yeah.
this is your book.
That's like what I love to read too, like
Do
all
you?
vibes, no
Oh, I
plot.
can't
Yeah.
wait to get to your book recommendations. That's going to be amazing. Okay, so another thing that I say is having a literary moment, another like a structural thing, is the lack of quotation marks. So I personally love this trend. I don't know if you call it a trend. I have, but the first time I really noticed it in recent memory is News of the World. Couple of, I don't know, gosh, years ago. But then it just, but I know a lot of people who don't like it. And a lot of people who say, oh, you don't know. And I just honestly, as a reader, I love how it looks on the page. I never wonder who's speaking. I don't, but I just think it looks clean. But it's a decision, right? It's a decision, a stylistic decision, I guess. Like, I'd love to know who made that decision. Was it you? Was it an editor?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I totally agree. I think it's controversial. I try not to look at Goodreads too often, but my husband looks at mine for me because he's
Oh,
fascinated by it.
yeah.
And every now and then he says, "Yours are all really good, but people complain about the lack of quotation marks."
Interesting.
And it's funny to me because I have read so many books that don't use them, so I didn't particularly think that I was making an outrageous or a controversial decision. To me, I'm like you. I just think it looks cleaner on the page. And I also, the book is so engaged with memory. And I think a lot about like how much can you ever trust your own memory or someone's retelling of an event. And so I think I also really wanted to imply like, this is the narrator telling her version of the story. She's not quoting these characters directly, because how could you ever really do that? So I often say that if there were quotation marks, there would be one, at the first sentence and one at the last sentence,
Right.
because even though she's not speaking this story out loud, it's her retelling and her rephrasing of events. And I really liked the way that you could play with dialogue within that form. I think that once I realized you could do a lot with what's sometimes called like received dialogue or reported
Mhm.
dialogue. That really kind of freed up speech for me in a way that I think previously writing dialogue had felt very rigid. So I was reading like Rachel Cusk is someone that does that really well in the Outline trilogy. She doesn't use quotation marks, I
Right.
don't believe. Sally Rooney doesn't use quotation marks,
Yes. I was trying to think.
which is probably one of the most popular examples. And
Right.
I found it funny when I was getting these kind of, complaints about no quotation marks, because I was like, Sally Rooney's so popular. And yeah,
Yeah,
anyway, it's
I do
interesting.
feel kind of like it is a new trend, but it's one that I fully embrace. And so this is a perfect segue to my next question. The first time I read this, I read it with my ears, I call it.
I love
I
that.
live and breathe by audiobooks because I
Mhm,
read so much, and I have a lot of like driving time,
mhm,
and I never like to be without a book. So anyway,
mhm.
when I found yours, and I always listened to a sample, and I was like, oh my God. And so talking to you here is like kind of this out of body experience because you are the narrator.
Mhm.
And I know I said that in my review. I said, if you want to, embark on this, if you are an audiobook listener, it is exquisite. Your voice just brings this, obviously, because it's set in Australia, because I mean, it was just like, it's perfect and it evokes the feeling. But it can go the other way. Author
Mhm.
narration sometimes. And I love to ask when the author that I spoke with the other day, Carl Gary of Juno Loves Legs, said he narrated one of his books and that he said it was just a tragedy. And I don't know if he meant, I mean, he's got a beautiful Irish accent. I don't know if we didn't dig into it, whether he felt he just didn't like doing it or whether it really didn't
Mhm.
come out well. But how did this decision get made? I mean, as soon as they heard you speak, I'm sure it wasn't hard, but would you do it again? Did you enjoy it?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for saying that. I feel like I rarely get to talk to people about the audio version of the book.
Mhm.
And it was actually something that was super important to me. I read everything out loud while I'm drafting. And so I always wrote the book for my own voice. And I felt like I could do it. And I wanted the narrator to have, an Australian accent. But of course, I was offered choices and I could have had an Australian actress if I wanted to. In my former kind of creative life, before I focused on writing, I was a musician. So I think also, I don't know, the sound of my voice is just very personal to me.
Right.
And I'm also not foreign to recording studios,
Okay.
performance. That world kind of felt familiar. But it is funny with the audiobook because people are really divided about it as well. Like I've heard some authors say like that would be my absolute worst nightmare because you do have to read your entire book out loud after you've already read it multiple times.
Right.
And I think that's something a lot of people don't really know unless you have a lot of author friends, is like just how many times you have to read your own book.
Yeah.
And so like there can be something kind of perhaps painful about having to read every single, and you can't change anything at that point, right? But to me, it just felt like the book is so personal. I just felt like I had to do it. I had to be me. But it was a process. I still had to audition. They don't just give it to you like automatically.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and
So it
honestly, it felt
isn't,
very high stakes because I was like, what if I fail my own audiobook audition? Like, how will I live with myself?
yeah, that's really intimidating.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, again, this is one of the better. I mean, they obviously, good thing you got the job.
Thank you.
This is one of the better, I mean, top three ever. And like I
Thank
said,
you.
easily half of my reading, I would say, I've never really counted, but I would say is done um via my ears. And
Mhm.
I think I've listened. I mean, I've really probably read this 3 times now because I listened to it again. I listened to some key parts again before we talked, but I also have the book and read. And that's when it's interesting because it is important. A lot of people talk about doing a hybrid read, doing both,
Mhm.
but because it is important to see how it looks on the page. And when I started reading it, I was like, oh, we don't have quotations. I love this book
Right,
even
right.
more.
That's so
and
interesting.
and I would never have known. I would never have known that. So, and I think this is a book I would have to, I'm always looking at, I love to look at cover art and
Mhm.
covers versus UK,
Mhm.
versus US covers and international
Yeah.
covers. And I'm pretty sure when I looked on Blackwell's, it's different.
It's
That
different. I can actually have a
you,
copy
oh, do
right
you?
next to me,
I'm trying to
which
remember.
I
I
don't
feel like,
always, but it's right here. So yeah, we
oh,
can do a
okay. Yes.
contrast and compare.
Yes. Do you have a preference? Is that like terrible to ask? It's like asking which
I
child you love more.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, I have to love them all in different ways.
Right.
I'm really happy with how they all turned out. I will say that the American edition was my first baby.
There's a
You
mood,
know,
there's a definite mood. Well,
it was the one that I saw the first and kind
right.
of set the tone of what's to come. So in my mind, I have a tendency to think of that as the like original.
Yeah,
Um, but I mean, I love the colors of the UK
I do
one.
too. Yeah.
I love how small it is. The Australian one uses this same cover image, but the text is a different color. And I'm
Okay.
really happy with how they all turned out. I love the moody skies of this
Yep.
one.
I am
Um,
fascinated with covers and why different covers are chosen and whether you as authors have, how much of a say you have in that. I think because it really goes to, you never get a second chance to make a first impression.
yes, yeah. Yeah, it's you kind of have, I think it varies from publisher to publisher, but you have a conversation about it. I think that generally speaking, authors have maybe less control than you would expect. I feel really fortunate that my book was published by 3 independent publishers, and
Mhm.
they, I think, just generally speaking, obviously, this is my first book, so I don't have that much experience to go on, but often the indies are a little bit more open
Yeah.
to you being involved in that process, and so I could, share some mood boards and things like that. But yeah, it's, there's so many different factors that go into building a book cover. And I think as an author, you have your own idea about what the book is and who it's for. And that is really important in some ways. But then the publisher has a different set of things that they're trying to achieve. So it's tricky to find something that makes everybody happy, I
Yeah.
think.
Strike that balance. Oh, I can
Yeah. And that will
imagine.
find the right reader for that book. And I think that's really what it's all about in the end.
I think it worked well.
Thank
I,
you.
I think it worked really well, but it is interesting. I have felt the other, the opposite way with some books. Lessons in Chemistry was one that I felt I
Mhm.
absolutely loved it, Bonnie Garmus, but I felt like the cover did it a bit of a disservice. It felt like it
Mhm.
was a book of such depth
Mhm.
and such scope and very women centric. And I don't know, I was just like, huh, if somebody hadn't said, no, 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 you need to read this book, I would have gone, right past
It
it. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I used to be a bookseller on and off at different periods of my life as well. So I have seen how that plays out in a bookstore environment and things like that. So it's been really interesting to have that intel and going through
Oh,
the
I
publication
bet.
process myself. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, thanks for talking about that part of it. I will get to the question that you do not have to answer, but I ask all my authors. And again, I know it's one of those, are, do you have something in the, pipeline again? Do you want to write again?
Yes, I definitely want to write again. I think it's going to take some time for me
Mhm.
to develop relationships with a new set of characters. I always say to my students, your characters are like relationships you have with real people, in that you get to know them the more time you spend with them.
Right.
So there are some new people in my head, and I'm getting to know them. But I'm also trying not to put any pressure on myself, because I'm a slow writer, and I
Mhm.
think I just kind of need to feel my way through that process. And also, honestly, this book was such a big part of my life. I feel like so much of my own coming of age was part of writing this novel, that I think part of me is kind of like, well, I just need to live a bit more and have some more experiences before, I really do feel like everything I was thinking about, everything I had to say went into this first book. And so I've got to kind of come up with a new set of questions for
Well,
myself.
it's one of those books that, I mean, I know you're not thinking this, but like that almost lends itself to like the next phase of her life. Like,
Right,
what
totally.
happens, I know I've had a lot of authors say it takes a while, even though you know you're going to write again and your things are like starting to get past these characters, to let them go, have them out of your head. You miss them. I had Carl Gary said that. He's like, I miss these two. I miss these main characters. And so, but it is my wish, my hope that you do, because I just absolutely was so smitten with this.
Thank you.
Okay, so last question, and I would love to know, and you've had warning about this. I always feel like people think I spring this on people. I would hate somebody to spring this on me. But I did warn her. Some books or authors that you love, that you recommend, that have been formative, anything.
Yeah, I always appreciate the heads up, because I feel like inevitably when someone asks, like, what have you been reading? I'm like, nothing. Like, it just vanishes from my brain.
Yep.
But since we were talking before about, no plot, all vibes, I'm going to recommend a few that I feel like are in that vein. So because it's summer, I really want to recommend 6 Days in Rome by Francesca Giacco. I don't know if you've read this one.
I
It
have.
actually just came out in paperback. But I love this book. It's so evocative. If you like, sensory writing about food, about travel, about sex, I just think that this is like a perfect summer read. A woman
And not
goes
a
to
bad
Rome,
cover.
and a really good cover. Exactly.
Yeah, I have that on my shelf. Yeah.
It's a great book, and I think it's perfect for this time of year with like a little Aperol spritz if you wish you were in Italy. I also really love this collection of short stories by Cara Blue Adams called You Never Get It Back. It's been out, has it been a year? Has it been 2 years?
I've seen
time?
it, but I have not read it.
But actually, I think you would really like this, because the stories span, New England to, the desert, to the South. And it's about coming of age as a young woman in America, interconnected short stories.
Coming of age sells me every time.
It's such a beautiful collection, and it does the kind of linked collection thing so well. It was on my mind because I just recommended it to a friend of mine. So we were talking about it, and she really loved it.
Short stories are hard to sell, right? I feel like you're either a short story lover or you're not. But I found that if I find the right author, I can absolutely be
and
sold
I
on
think,
them.
I mean, I love a short story, but I think that sometimes what's a barrier for people is that you don't get to develop that kind of long relationship with a character. Like, my husband always says that, because he's like really big on novels and stories. He's kind of like, you only get to be with these people for such a short glimpse of time. But I think the linked collection, offers that experience of like getting to follow a character over a period of years, sometimes even more than you would in a novel. Like, I think the Elizabeth Strout, like the Olive Kitteridge books, are such a good example of that.
Right.
It would be so difficult to span that many years in a novel, but she can kind of dip into these different moments in time. And then I also really love, just because it's a forever favorite, The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. Definitely one for animal lovers and dog lovers.
I love
and
this
no quotation marks.
And no quotation marks. I love this book too. This book made me weep. I loved it. And then I read more about her. Was it in Paris Review? I don't know. I read I think it was in the Paris Review.
Probably.
Beautiful. I think when they did their fiction section, more about her. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole about her as an author, but that is, I recommended that one as well. We have similar tastes. I love it.
And then I think if I was going to throw one more in the mix, just because I can, it would be Territory of Light by Yuko Tashima.
Don't know this one.
Yuko Tashima was actually writing in the 70s in Japan, but this got translated again into English a few years ago. It's beautiful if you like mother-daughter stories. It's what I think of as like another quiet book, that is, I feel like people often use that word quiet in a kind of negative way, but it's powerful. Quiet can be powerful.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that that's the books that I am drawn to are
Yeah.
that way predominantly.
Yeah, me too. Clearly we do have similar
You
tastes.
can,
So
yeah, you can recommend books to me anytime. I will probably go through these, the ones I haven't read, and then
thank you.
reach out
That
to
was
you for
fun. I
more.
felt like I was being a bookseller again. So thank you
Oh,
for
did you
indulging
like
me.
that part of your career? I know, I can't
Yeah.
imagine how much fun that is. And that's an art,
Yes,
right? It's an
absolutely.
art because we spend a lot of time in bookstores, and you know, when you really do like meet somebody in a bookstore when they say, "Can I help you?" and they actually can
Yeah.
tapping into someone. If I said, you know, I liked this,
Yeah.
I want something else like it. So
Yeah.
that's and I think that's why I said August is going to be difficult for me. I think August is a hard month for reading because it's like a gap month before the big, you
Hmm.
know, fall fiction comes out.
Oh,
But
of course. Yeah.
July had your book and Juno Loves Legs and a bunch of others that just hit me so well. And then you end up with that kind of what I call the book hangover that is big. So I'm excited for these recommendations, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I know a lot of people who follow me and who I talk to have also read and loved this, and we're just really looking forward to hearing your beautiful voice and hearing all about you writing this novel that hit us in all the
Awesome.
ways the best fiction does.
Thank you so much, Deb. Honestly, it was a pleasure. I loved chatting with you. So
Oh,
hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
oh, maybe I'll see you in New York.
Yes.
I would love that. So many of the authors I've talked to are up there, and I'm like, oh, I would love to get together, have a glass of wine, and talk books.
Yeah, that would be so much fun.
No, well, you never say never, right? All right, Madelaine, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Okay, thanks so much,
All
Deb.
right,
Take care. Bye.
bye.